introduce the project and the genre of tonight's talk before Julia starts. So, one second. Sorry, I just pulled it up and now it's gone.
Maybe we can play a jingle.
So, the Platters Affiliated Society, established in December 2006 in Chicago, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism, such as this teach-in today, on a focus on the problems and tasks inherited from the old left, that is from the 1920s to 30s, from the new left, from the 60s to 70s, and from the post-political 80s to 90s left, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. We're a pretty international organization. We have chapters all around the world, prominently in America, in Germany, in England, in Cork, there's one now, in Dublin, we have one. And we host typically reading groups, as I just said, panel discussions, coffee breaks. We do coffee breaks here in Dublin every Thursday at University College, and every Friday at Costa by Trinity. And we do teach-ins, such as the one tonight, on Walter Benjamin's philosophy of history. And I'm just going to briefly read out the prompt before Julia starts. Oh, hey. All right. I just started introducing that first, so we have to check. So tonight, the prompt is there progress in history? If so, how can we tell? Can history be in crisis? Can we assign any meaning to the boundless suffering of previous generations, or was it all for nothing? Is the present haunted by them? And how should we relate to the past? Walter Benjamin's Theses on History, written in 1940, may help us answer these questions. Known for the rich variety of his writings, from art criticism to philosophy, Benjamin remains an obscure figure. Often he's referred to as a Jewish mystic or a postmodernist defender of the rights of the subaltern. This teaching, however, will depict Benjamin in an altogether different light. We will try to understand him as holding on to the Marxist idea of liberation against the background of a present which more and more reveals its fundamental barbarism. So the teaching genre is that basically Julia is just going to give a talk on Benjamin's philosophy of history, and then afterwards, so she's going to be talking for about 45, 50 minutes, and afterwards we'll have time for discussion, which is supposed to be a very, it's not like a Q&A type thing, but more like general debate on what Julia said, criticism, questions, contestations, and afterwards we'll be here for like 2 hours, maybe we have the room for 2 hours, but afterwards there's time for, I guess, more of an informal discussion and celebration at a pub. Yes, so do feel free to join us later, probably, I don't know, at Doyle's or at the Oscar Wilde pub, we'll see. Good.
All right, thank you. My young son asks me, must I learn mathematics? What is the use, I feel like saying? That 2 pieces of bread are more than once about all you'll end up with? My young son asks me, must I learn French? What is the use, I feel like saying? This state's collapsing, and if you just rub your belly with your hand and groan, you'll be understood with little trouble. My young son asks me, must I learn history? What is the use? I feel like saying. Learn to stick your head in the earth and maybe you'll still survive. Yes, learn mathematics, I tell him. Learn your French, learn your history. This poem is titled 1940, after the year which led Bertolt Brecht to compose these rather hopeless words. Swallowing his resignation towards a time on which the Hitler-Stalin Pact is agreed upon, a worldwide war shatters the planet, and Nazi Germany slowly but steadily turns into an anti-Semitic slaughterhouse, Brecht turns to the coming generation and tells his son to learn his history. During these times, how and why at all? Brecht's friend Walter Benjamin's thesis on history, written in the same year, might have provided an answer. With not much more than the thesis in his suitcase, Benjamin, who was a Jew, intended to flee to Europe to go to America in 1940. But he was held back in Portbou by Franco's police, and in fear of being delivered to the Germans, he committed suicide. In light of these times, it seems somewhat surprising that one of Benjamin's main objects of critique in his very last text, the thesis on history, is not the right, but the left. Not fascism, but Stalinism and social democracy. Being blinded by a false security and holding a dogmatic belief in unshakable historical progress, they were accused by Benjamin of having contributed to the possibility of fascism. By stating that, quote, every day our cause becomes clearer and the people more clever, end of quote, social democrats like Dietzgen had ossified the idea of the revolution being the locomotive of history, as Marx and Engels said in the Communist Manifesto on the eve of the 1848 uprisings. The revolution of 1848, however, failed to overcome capitalism, or as Marx called it, prehistory. In the second half of the 19th century, social democracy took on their struggle. However, due to, as Benjamin said, the, quote, conformism which has dwelt within social democracy from the very beginning, end of quote, and a lack of theoretical and political flexibility to reconsider their possibilities in a changed political situation, they failed in fulfilling the task they inherited. Benjamin writes that, quote, social democratic theory, and still more the praxis, was determined by a concept of progress which did not hold to reality, but had a dogmatic claim. Progress, as it was painted in the minds of the social democrats, was once upon a time the progress of humanity itself, not only that of its abilities and knowledges. It was secondly something unending, something corresponding to an endless perfectibility of humanity. And it counted thirdly as something essentially unstoppable, as something self-activating, pursuing a straight or spiral path. End of quote. Thereby, social democracy, according to Benjamin, became ignorant of the fact that short of overcoming prehistory, there might actually be no progress at all. In 1914, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, the SPD, voted in favor of the First World War, which was fought out with an unprecedented use of modern weaponry. Although he would become interested in Marxist idea only in 1924, in a letter to his friend Gershom Scholem, he expressed his sympathies for Karl Liebknecht, who together with Rosa Luxemburg objected to the decision of their party in 1914, founding the USPD and later the Revolutionary Spartakusbund. Both were assassinated as a consequence of a plot in which members of the Social Democratic Party were involved. In his 12th thesis, Benjamin comments on that event. Quote, in Marx, the proletariat steps forward as the final enslaved and avenging class, which carries out the work of emancipation in the name of generations of downtrodden to its conclusion. This consciousness, which for a short time made itself felt in the Spartacus, was objectionable to social democracy from the very beginning." End of quote. It was in 1924, too, that Benjamin met Siegfried Krakauer and Theodor W. Adorno in a seminar at Frankfurt University. The latter would not only publish Benjamin's thesis in 1940, but become an important fellow intellectual to him as well. The year Benjamin got interested in Marxism was also the year of Lenin's death, in the wake of which Stalinism emerged. Considering the period of decline within the history of a revolutionary left that Benjamin experienced, it is perhaps of no wonder that he became known as a theorist of regression. Regression is widely known as a concept in statistics. But when it comes to history, what is it such a term refers to? Regression happens when a phenomenon repeats itself, but in a stagnated or lower stage than it was in before. Historical regression occurs when something, take the consciousness of society of a certain problem, for example, falls behind what was once achieved. It occurs when the horizon of possibilities a generation inherits is more narrow than the one of the generation that preceded it. But if there is a conception of regression, there must be a corresponding conception of progress. Didn't I mention before that Benjamin criticized social democracy of their progressive optimism? Yes, I did. But according to Benjamin, quote, "a stubborn belief in progress," end of quote, can itself be regressive. Still, it seems that there must be a criterion for a regression. A standpoint is required from which it can be judged if something reappears in a higher or lower stage. And that benchmark for Benjamin is the standpoint of redeemed history. The possibility of a redemption of history makes it possible for him to mark any development that falls short of redemption as a regression from what is possible. Redemption sounds like a religious category, and it's also true that Benjamin's Marxism is nurtured by the Jewish theology. However, Benjamin writes that, quote, "nothing historical can relate itself on its own account to anything messianic. Therefore, the order of the profane cannot be built up on the idea of the divine kingdom. Instead, the order of the profane should be erected on the idea of happiness. The profane, therefore, although not itself a category of the divine kingdom, is a decisive category of its quietest approach. For in happiness, all that is earthly seeks its downfall, and only in good fortune is its downfall destined to find it." End of quote. So for now, think of redemption, or this criterion, as what might be reached in the course of reaching happiness. With regard to historical regression, in this talk, my goal is to give an outline of what Benjamin's theory of history entails. Some general introductory words on that. The thesis on history are a constellation of 18 theses and 2 addenda that were originally meant to be used as an introduction to Benjamin's work on the Parisian arcades. Unfolding his own conception of history, Benjamin is mainly concerned in this text with the rejection of 2 ways of approaching history. First, the optimistic ideology of endless progress that I've already mentioned. And second, the conception of historicism that rejects the possibility of a redeemed history altogether, because it intends to look at the past without drawing any connection to the present at all. So, contrary to this, in Benjamin's understanding, history should be understood as a self-relation of the present, as a way in which the present relates to itself. The relation of the present to the past is bidirectional, so the past judges the present and is judged by it. But I will come to what that means later. For now, in order to clarify the concept of history as a self-relation of the present, consider the following analogy. In our own biographies, we relate to ourselves as human beings with our memories of the past. In the way we speak of our past, we will probably hold on to a story that permits us to perceive ourselves as the person we are in the present. What we gain through that narration is a certain consciousness of ourselves and of our possibilities in the present. But we might as well use the story of our past as an excuse for who we are and what we have and what we might not have achieved in life. History is not much different. Unlike in biography, however, in history the whole of society relates to itself. How society undertakes this self-relation and what it tells itself about itself through its history in a certain epoch of its development may be questioned by the critical thinker who notices that rather than for the self-consciousness of its possibilities, the story society tells about itself has become more of an excuse that furthers self-satisfaction. This is what Benjamin aims for in his critique. On the one hand, we have social democracy's historical optimism, which squanders the possibility of revolutionary change of society by sticking to a self-satisfactory belief of the emancipated heirs. It is not the unnecessary suffering, not the missed opportunities of the past that they seem to build their idea of progress upon. The past here doesn't judge the present. Any desired change of the present is motivated rather by an idea of a more emancipated future. Historicism, on the other hand, takes every state of the historical development to have an independent logic that allows to cut it off from everything we know about its future. Thereby, it makes it impossible to gain anything out of that consciousness for the present. It is the way in which the present relates to itself that actually refuses to relate to itself. Benjamin's idea of how the present should relate to itself by referring to its past is different altogether. Placing his idea of history in the tradition of orthodox Marxism, Benjamin appropriates the term historical materialism in order to introduce his own conception of history. As I've said before, Marx himself was in a way optimistic about the course of the proletarian revolution, acting as a locomotive of history. Why then does Benjamin hold on to Marx, but at the same time invokes that the passengers of that train need to pull the emergency brake? In order to understand all of this better, it is helpful to first gain an overview of the theoretical foundations and on the concept of history itself. The version of history Benjamin criticizes as quote-unquote empty, namely progressing linearity, has not always been the way in which the present related to itself. It has its roots in the development of human history as well. So let's have a look at the historicity of history before turning back to Benjamin. Throughout the ancients, and even until the late medieval epoch, the dominating concept of time was cyclical, modeled on the organic cycle of life processes. As Benjamin puts it, and in antiquity, people considered themselves to be one with the cosmos reigning over them. Early forms of historical consciousness can be found in the form of heroic narrations of great deeds in Homer, or in a form of historical chronology, for example, of royal lineages, as in biblical texts, for example, where you have King David. But the concept of history, as we refer to it today, emphatically only emerges with the rise of modernity. And the growing self-consciousness of the bourgeoisie. The Enlightenment philosophers increasingly suggested that history is no longer subject to the will of God, but rather it's available to the active transformation by and for man. Simultaneously, the question of meaning for humankind arises anew. I will read out a quote in a second. By Louis Menand. In pre-modern societies, the ends of life are given at the beginning of life. People do things in their generation so that the same things will continue to be done in the next generation. Meaning is immanent in all the ordinary customs and practices of existence, since these are inherited from the past and therefore worth reproducing. The idea is to make the world go not forward, only around. In modern societies, the ends of life are not given at the beginnings of life. They are thought to be created or discovered. The reproduction of the customs and practices of the group is no longer the chief purpose of existence. The idea is not to repeat, but to change, to move the world forward. Meaning is no longer immanent in the practices of ordinary life, since those practices are understood by everyone to be contingent and time-bound. End of quote. It may be considered today with remorse or relief, but with the beginning of modernity, humankind became the master of its own fate, and it found itself challenged by the task of giving its own meaning to it. Only with the modern concept of linearity in history, humankind shattered the mythical powers of the cosmos and the future opened up. The French revolutionaries of the Third Estate, who stormed the Bastille in 789, were conscious of that fact. Benjamin writes, quote, "The consciousness of exploding the continuum of history is peculiar to the revolutionary classes in the moment of their action. The Great French Revolution introduced a new calendar. The day on which the calendar started functioned as a historical time-lapse camera. And it is fundamentally the same day which, in the shape of holidays and memorials, always returns. The calendar does not therefore count time like clocks. They are monuments of a historical awareness, of which there has not seemed to be the slightest trace for 100 years. Yet in the July Revolution, an incident took place which did justice to this consciousness. During the evening of the first skirmishes, it turned out that the clock towers were shot at independently and simultaneously in several places in Paris." End of quote. With the newly achieved freedom of the bourgeoisie, the cyclical, motionless experience of pre-modernity was replaced by the idea of revolutionary freedom. Kant's historical philosophical writing bears witness to this development. Nature has willed, Kant writes, that man should, by himself, produce everything that goes beyond the mechanical ordering of his animal existence, and that he should partake of no other happiness or perfection than that which he himself, independently of instinct, has created by his own reason. End of quote. He also reflects on the meaning of history, for on the face of it, he admits the course of history appears rather chaotic. Quote, "History permits us to hope that if we attend to the play of freedom of the human will in the large, we may be able to discern a regular movement in it, and that what seems complex and chaotic in the single individual may be seen from the standpoint of the human race as a whole to be a steady and progressive, though slow evolution of its original endowment. End of quote. So as you may notice, this coincides with the general intention that Benjamin will later ascribe to social democracy, who, heavily influenced by the neo-Kantian thought, changed Marx's idea of the revolution being the locomotive of history to a revolutionary situation that seemed to end up in an infinite ride. Long before Benjamin criticized this idea in 1940, it was first to be objected by Hegel. What Hegel disliked about Kant's idea was that it renounced the possibility of reconciliation. Could freedom not be ultimately realized within the course of history? Looking at history as a whole, from Hegel's standpoint, it appeared as one big movement in which the general tendency in humanity seemed to be one of liberation. Hegel's dialectical understanding of the world's history, therefore, evolved around the progress of spirit in the consciousness of its freedom. The freedom of the subject, understood as a concept, became more and more important during the course of the epochs. While in ancient Oriental tyrannies, only one individual was considered to be free, namely the ruler, and in ancient Greece, a few citizens claimed to be free, Christendom introduced the idea of a universal freedom of the subject, and bourgeois society realized it. The Third Estate revolutionaries, in a pamphlet of Abbé de Sieyès, asked, quote, "What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been hitherto in the political order? Nothing. What does it desire to be? To become something." End of quote. And as we saw before, it did become everything. Positive about that, Hegel, who stressed the idea of reconciliation, took freedom to have already succeeded within history. With the Third Estate becoming everything after the bourgeois revolution, for Hegel it looked like universal freedom had been realized. He suggested, therefore, that reality had become reasonable and history reconciled. Although both Kant and Hegel considered history to be the development of freedom, the question of disaster and evil within this historical movement struck them as important. Both felt obligated to answer it, although in an entirely different manner than Benjamin would later do it. Kant integrates evil into the development of freedom in history by allowing the unsociable sociability of human beings to become the motor of their evolution of freedom in history. By confronting each other antagonistically, people are challenged to perfectibility and progress. Through and because of this antagonism, society develops, and in the long run, it develops towards freedom. Hegel, too, doesn't deny that the slaughter bench as which the history of humanity can appear can bring tears to one's eyes. But from his point of view, which he took to be the standpoint of realized freedom, some sacrifices retrospectively appeared necessary to him. Necessary because it was them that led to freedom. If for Hegel history seemed reconciled with the triumph of the Third Estate, and freedom seemed to be fully realized in the absolute spirit that had become conscious of itself, history betrayed Hegel. Or rather, he was betrayed by the starving masses in the streets of 1848, claiming to be citizens too, and asking to be treated as equals. They appeared on the face of history as soon as the Industrial Revolution, which brought about a great potential for society's well-being, At the same time, it introduced, however, extreme poverty. Many of the people out in the street would have lost their jobs because machines that could have reduced the amount of work for anyone had replaced not necessary labor time, but instead them. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, the antagonism within society, which Kant praised as a motor of the freedom and rationality of society, became destructive. Yet it remained the ordering principle. Even though machines tended to reduce necessary labor time in production, the worker's ability to survive still depended on wages and hence employment. But less people were required in the factories. People who had nothing to sell but their own labor and wanted and needed to work, for the first time in history, could not find any work. Competing to sell their labor on the market, they drove down their own wages. The antagonism hence no longer furthered the wealth of the whole of society. Instead, as an ordering principle of society, it lost its rationality. If only Hegel had witnessed this, but Hegel died in 1831, shortly before the uprising. Many of his disciples, while holding on to his thought, accused him of not living up to his own dialectics, when he described the historical movement of a motion of the absolute spirit towards the consciousness of freedom as something that had come to a triumphant end. The ruling rationality was produced in and through the people, and yet seemed to have turned against them. The young Hegelians defended the right of the single phenomenon against Hegel's overarching story of history, advocating the necessity of a philosophical turn to the subjects of history. They would soon become Marx's object of critique. Himself a young Hegelian, he criticized those odd theoreticians who, in the wake of an ongoing revolution, posited claims against Hegel on a mere philosophical ground. Instead of holding against Hegel that man should from now on be the center of philosophy, stressing that living subjects are a necessary condition for any absolute spirit to evolve, Marx turned away from their philosophical fights and turned to those of the living subjects. He spent a lot of time studying the bourgeois economy, showing the inner contradictions of this antagonism as an ordering principle. When the victims of those contradictions, the wage slaves, marched the streets, Marx provided them with a manifesto. By analyzing their situation, he sought for the realization of the idea of the once revolutionary third estate that became ideological when the Industrial Revolution introduced a new class that so far politically was nothing and wanted to become something. When the bourgeois class continued to claim to be everything, this struck Marx as a false claim of a partiality. Modernity's fight for an enlightened society seemed to him as a yet unfulfilled project. I'm quoting from the Communist Manifesto. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonism. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinct feature. It has simplified class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. End of quote. In holding on to the unfulfilled potential of the project of humanity, Marx, in the word of Louis Minot, quote, gave a meaning to modernity. It's said that, wittingly or not, the individual performs a role in that drama that has a shape and a goal, a trajectory, and that modernity will turn out to be just one act in that drama. Historical change is not arbitrary. It is generated by class conflict. It is faithful to an inner logic. It points towards an end, which is the establishment of the classless society. End of quote. Besides the young Hegelians, on the other hand, a school of historians emerged, who hoped to continue historiography in an Hegelian spirit, the right Hegelians. Historicism, to which Benjamin responds, must be understood against this background, namely as a critique of this Hegelian historical school. Inspired by Vico and Herder, theorists such as Leopold von Ranke advocated the idea that every epoch was equidistant from God, instead of being one big movement towards him. Thereby, they explicitly negated the Hegelian school's idea of continuous progress. Even though Benjamin was critical of the conceptions of history as progress he witnessed, renouncing the idea of progress once and for all was not his intention either. Quite the opposite. For now, we are approaching the second half of the 19th century, when Benjamin was born. The century had seen the failure of the 1848 uprisings. It saw the integration of the discontents of the uprising classes into centralized party systems. The Franco-German War, with the coronation of Wilhelm in Versailles, the era of the Philistine, and the new form of privacy that people like to retreat to. It was most certainly not the best decade for someone like Nietzsche, hungering for greatness to be born into. Or maybe Nietzsche only hungered for it so much because his century lacked it. Surprisingly, as Nietzsche diagnoses, the melancholic attitude towards history coincided with a historical fever, an excess of historical knowledge. Nietzsche presents the overload of history as an inhibitor of society's vitality. Quote, "We need history, but we need it differently than the idle stroller in the garden of knowledge needs it." End of quote. An overload of history becomes the cause of nihilistic apathy. History is a burden to man. Those who remember too much will never lift a finger. To be able to live, to act, man needs his unhistorical consciousness. The animal's secret to happiness is achieved by its ability to forget. If men seek to overcome their lethargy, they must be both historical as the idler and unhistorical as the animal. And here we will turn back to Benjamin, who was heavily influenced by Nietzschean thought. Any construction of history as a whole, any form of universal history, points to the problem of what to cite and what to leave unmentioned, of what is to be remembered and what can be forgotten, which voices to lend an ear to and which ones to ignore as background rambling. Any attempt to subsume history under an overarching narrative is hence confronted with the problem of distance in the relation between single events and the overarching narrative. Distancing itself from the singular events is required if in any kind of story that aims to put them together in a logical sense, as universal history aims to. Hereby, a form of continuation is proposed that perhaps needs to roll over singular events and phenomena in order to hold up the narrative. For Benjamin, the whole of history is present in any given fragment of it, like any given fragment or a single phenomena or element of it. It is therefore unnecessary to come up with an overarching story of history. Benjamin salvages the method of induction, as Adorno says, to restore the significance of singular phenomena, as he doesn't take them as phenomena subsumed as content under one category, but expressive of the category itself. But if we only look at the single phenomena, how do we get to a concept of history? If every phenomenon is expressive of its origin, there must be a way to decipher the whole from the cited fragment. If in every piece of reality we perceive, every piece of culture that surrounds us, the whole of human history, for Benjamin, is preserved like an inner temporal kernel. And by immersing yourself in the fragment, the whole in it lights up. That explains, for example, why Benjamin writes about things like children's short stories, or the life of students, or about Parisian arcades. Not because they interest him only in themselves, but as expressive of all of history, which is conserved, for example, in the concept of an arcade. But in order to conceive of history in a meaningful way, is it still necessary to suggest a form of continuation? Yes and no. Even though Benjamin criticizes the idea of a continuation of history in the form of universal history, one might say that he suggests one implicitly by turning it into a negative one. As Adorno puts it, quote, "From the recent form of injustice," so that might be a fragment or a single phenomena, "a steady light reflects back on history as a whole," end of quote. So when Benjamin immerses himself in several fragments of history, he notices that the whole that shines back at him in one point seems rather consistent. Quote, "For without exception, the cultural treasures the historical materialist surveys have an origin which he cannot contemplate without horror. They owe their existence not only to the efforts of the great minds and talents who have created them, but also to the anonymous toil of their contemporaries. There is no document of culture, of civilization, which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And just as such a document is not free of barbarism, barbarism taints also the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to another. A historical materialist therefore dissociates from himself from it as far as possible. He regards it as his task to brush history against the grain." End of quote. To brush history against the grain is thus to suggest a form of continuation, but a continuation of discontinuity. Why? Because so far it has been history has been told only from the standpoint of the victor. The individual phenomena it needed to roll over in order to keep up its overarching narrative have so far never found an adequate place in it, because they always questioned the narration's universality. In being one single expression of the narrative of the victor, universal history, for example Hegel's, presents itself as one big continuation, for example of progress. How eruptive all transformation might appear, for Benjamin, the new so far turned out to be nothing else but the old lying close at hand. The new rulers come and besiege others. The mythical powers of the cosmos shrink. Rome falls. Christianity spreads the idea of God and man being one. The power of the church trembles. Feudalism gets abolished by a third estate. The new, however, is only the old in distress, as Adorno puts it. That is only a new variation of suppression and suffering. So if there is a continuation in history, it is a negative one, because insofar history was shaped by suppression and suffering, nothing has ever changed. Here I quote from the famous thesis about the Angelus Novus, which is a picture that actually Benjamin bought. So he had this picture, and it became very famous. It's by Paul Klee, also because Benjamin was reflecting on it in this thesis that I'm going to read out. Quote, where we see the appearances of a chain of events, the angel of history sees one single catastrophe, which unceasingly piles rubble on top of rubble and hurls it before his feet. He would like to pause for a moment so fair, to awaken the dead and to piece together what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has caught itself up in its wings and is so strong that the angel can no longer close them. The storm drives him irresistibly into the future, to which his back is turned, while the rubble heap before him rose sky high. That which we call progress is this storm. End of quote. From the standpoint of the present, for Benjamin, history as a whole appears as one big dynamism motored by the ones in power. The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the emergency situation in which we live is the rule. Recall for a moment that he writes that under fascism. But if it is true that the whole of history turns out to be one big catastrophe, and the chains of events we perceive are in fact only new rubbles and hurls of horror and suffering, quote, then we must arrive at a concept of history which corresponds to this. Then it will become clear that the task before us is the introduction of a real state of emergency, and our position in the struggle against fascism will thereby improve. End of quote. If history is an endless dynamism of victors replacing victors, it turns out to be the same cyclicality of that in faith and myth. Its progress remains semblance, its time empty. This is why, despite the moment of movement in history, as a tormenting storm of progress towards the future, Benjamin highlights the other side of the dialectic, the standstill, the emergency break. History itself, that so far was only a fate-like continuation of discontinuity, needs to be overcome. The historical materialist understands why. He understands that, quote from Adorno, only he who recognizes the new as the same old thing will be of service to whatever is different. End of quote. The right attitude towards history must therefore explode history out of its mythical continuum. In order for history to be redeemed, a tiger's leap into the past is required. The empty time needs to come to a standstill. It needs to be filled up with the messianic here and now. With reference to Marx, the intention of that becomes clearer. History, as Marx writes, has always been the history of class struggle. If Benjamin holds on to this idea while defending the tradition of the suppressed past, he does it against the background in which that class struggle still remains. Unlike in Marx times, however, for Benjamin, the subject of historical consciousness, the oppressed class, has regressed in its self-consciousness. The way it related to itself in Benjamin's time has become self-satisfactory. Social democracy, quote, contented itself with assigning the working class the role of the savior of future generations. It thereby severed the sinews of its greatest power. Through this schooling, the class forgot its hate as much as its spirit of sacrifice, for both nourish themselves on the picture of enslaved forebears, not on the ideal of the emancipated heirs. End of quote. The generation of downtrodden are not only being silenced by historicism, who rejects the idea of the connection to the present altogether, but also by social democracy. Benjamin writes, the danger affects both the content of the tradition and its receivers. The same threat hangs over both, that of becoming a tool of the ruling classes. In every era, the attempt must be made to wrest tradition away from a conformism that is about to overpower it. The Messiah comes not only as the Redeemer, he comes as the subduer of Antichrist. End of quote. Not recognizing that the big chain of events that unfolds in front of our eyes is in reality one horrific story will lead to a fatal misrecognition of the present situation. But say we conceive of history as one big catastrophe and take responsibility for the past's judgment of our situation. How do we find even the strength to lift a finger? How do we find meaning in learning French or in learning mathematics if the meaning of history is not at all clear anymore? How can we be receptive of the burden of the past without succumbing to it? What makes the historical materialist receptive of the judgment of the past without making him succumb to its burden is his awareness of the, quote, secret protocol between the generations of the past and that of our own. For it has been given to us, just like every generation before us, a weak messianic power on which the past has a claim. End of quote. The historical materialist, who intends to refer to history from the standpoint of redemption, thus articulates the past in a way that is aware of this claim. In the past, he recognizes a potential for the present, but he is aware, too, of the boundlessness of unnecessary suffering that brought the present about and calls for its redemption. The adequate way to approach history is thus to remember. But the historical materialist is neither a collector of data nor a chronicler whose work prevents forgetting, nor is he interested in history for the sake of empathy in order to just understand a certain epoch, satisfying an arbitrary yet feverish historical thirst like the historicist historian. Rather, quote, historical materialism supplies a unique experience with the past. The historical materialist leaves it to others to be drained by the whore called once upon a time in historicism's bordello. He remains in control of his powers, man enough to blast open the continuum of history. End of quote. To remember doesn't mean to be an idle stroller in the garden of knowledge. Unlike historicism's claim that the truth will not run away from us, Benjamin's historian is confronted with a crystallized, fleeting image of the past that whizzes by. To articulate history, therefore, cannot simply mean to tell how it really was. Approaching history as remembrance, rather, requires to, quote, take control of a memory as it flashes in the moment of danger, end of quote. The historical materialist finds himself in an emergency situation that he knows to be not an exception, but the rule. In pulling the emergency brake, he aims to deliver the endangered tradition of the oppressed, whose voices are constantly at the point of being silenced once and forever. Quote, only that historian will have the gift of fanning the spark of hope in the past, who is firmly convinced that even the dead will not be saved from the enemy if he wins. And this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. End of quote. In 1940, when the midnight of the 20th century was approaching, Benjamin's thesis on history reconsidered Hegel's idea of history being a slaughter bench. The catastrophe history culminated in didn't allow Benjamin to perceive in it the reconciled reality Hegel had suggested. Hence, all of history's sacrifices that had led to Hegel's freedom in Benjamin's reality remained unfulfilled. The Hegelian dialectics from Benjamin's point in history thus appeared to him as a negative one. With Marx, Benjamin agreed that the antagonism which Kant naturalized and Hegel overshadowed was no longer serving society, and that prehistory, the history of class struggles, needed to be overcome. Unlike in Marx's time, the consciousness of that need in Benjamin's was much less prevalent. It was obscured not at least by the promoters of Marxism themselves. So the questions with which I'd like to end this are, has something changed since Benjamin's death? How does his memory judge our present? Has there been progress since then? For as long as history remains in its mythical form, perpetuating the continuation of discontinuity, whatever changes only renews the old drama with a different masquerade. Only for redeemed history, says Benjamin, each of its moments becomes citable. Until then, the color overshadowing the picture of history remains blood red, and every document of culture one of barbarism. Today, the memory of Benjamin's thought might be endangered, for not even the dead will be saved from the enemy if he wins, and this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. So, any remarks?
First, thank you so much for the teacher. Yeah, I mean, in the face of climate crisis and an age of multiple crises, and where people are screaming that everything is worse, it's getting worse and worse. I think that it is yet worth looking back to people who also had it very bad, maybe way bad, maybe worse than we had.
So you think it's important to look back to the past?
It is
In this way?
it's important to recall his view on history, to not drown ourselves in panic.
You mean like Benjamin can speak to us nowadays because because he articulates a way of looking at history that that is maybe in need of, or from the background of a time that is maybe in need of looking for a way of not getting overwhelmed by the burden of history, or maybe something like this.
I think he speaks through so many people we encounter in everyday life. I remember hearing a person speaking about that she isn't comfortable calling herself a socialist because of all those bad things that happened under the name of socialism, and having this socialist guilt and not knowing how to deal with history and not knowing how to relate to the past as a whole, which is a bit different than people who are panicking over the climate crisis, of course. But I think it comes from a maybe similar notion.
So in the thesis of philosophy of history, Benjamin seems to distinguish mostly between self-aggrandizing social democrats who conceive of like an automatic progress of history, and then also effectively just like nihilistic academics who see history as just an empty form of time in which they can fill with content.
Right.
Positive reading of history. But he doesn't really refer to this, but I'm very interested in fascistic and Nazi interpretations of history as something that can, it's some sort of strange combination between both of these, and they believe that they can somehow return to a past model of history while also holding on to a lot of kind of progressive notions of like organic growth or technological progress or whatever. And I'm wondering if Benjamin or anyone else wrote anything interesting about this, or if you can recommend any specific readings on that sort of that sort of thing, which Benjamin seemed to not have discussed for the most part.
At the moment, like nothing comes to mind, but maybe Patrick. It seemed like no. I know that there's like some work on the fascist annihilation of Hegel's work. That could maybe be a point where you could start searching for it, but I'm not sure.
Three things come to mind in terms of like fascist self-understanding. One of them is the first thing that Goebbels said in the speech when Hitler seized power was, we're now beginning to undo 1789. Julia referenced it earlier, the French Revolution and the sort of political self-consciousness of modernity, and sort of giving modernity even a temporal sort of objectification through the calendars and so on. So there's this idea that we're undoing modernity, and that entails we're undoing historical time in general, I would say, and that becomes manifest in phrases like the idea of a 1,000-year-old Reich, which is we commonly refer to Nazi Germany as the Third Reich, but that was actually not the self-understanding, that's like the historiographical term. They understood it as the 1,000-year-long Reich, meaning the Reich that has no history. It doesn't develop. And the third thing that comes to mind is also a description by Goebbels, which is that Nazism is like iron romanticism. So it's like romanticism in the sense that it has this historicist impulse of every epoch is equidistant from God, and we can also revel in the past, and they certainly did, like artistically. There's lots of references to medieval Europe and ancient Greece and so on. There is this like eclectic historicism to it, but it's like iron in the sense that there's technological progress. I mean, these are like fascist self-understandings, and thereby very muddled and irrational. But I think that gives more than anything.
I mean, I was just maybe one thing to add is just you have, as I mentioned, like there's things like Wilhelm Reich, the description of like, because fascism does kind of emerge. That's why it is this kind of dual character, because it does kind of, Mussolini and Marxist, it does kind of emerge out of, in a sense, out of socialism in a certain way. It's sort of the quote that up until Reich says, up until the 1930s, there's a sort of revolutionary movement in Germany based on the ideas of Karl Marx, but it's now based on Nazism, and he used this sort of formulation of the sort of like the struggle for freedom had produced like the fear of freedom, which is what like fascism kind of embodies. That's kind of why it is this sort of, as you said, this kind of strange like dual character of like looking in two directions, if you will.
Then maybe I'm not like another like rather right-wing conception of time or of history would be Oswald Spengler, I suppose. But I'm not familiar with what he writes. I just know that he like couples Goethean metamorphosis idea with maybe you know
Very
more.
cyclical.
Yeah. Okay. Cyclical, right?
That's also one way of getting at it. It's also when Hitler died, he staged himself or his death as the death of Barbarossa, which was like a medieval German king who, when he died, there's this legend that he just retreated to the mountains, and once the German people regains its glory, then he will come back and be the German king again. So it's like Hitler then staged himself as the second Barbarossa, and he will come back as well. It's just like saying, it's never ending. Once the German people reach his glory, then the kings come back again.
I forget who. There was a very major Nazi official who actually thought that he was the second incarnation of a significant German king. But
Right.
Sorry?
No, I don't know. Yeah, but sounds true.
And then, of course, there's this perversion of Nietzsche's idea of vitality, I guess.
But I
So-
don't think Hitler read Nietzsche specifically.
No?
He
No.
was very popular amongst Nazis.
But he was also acquainted with Nietzsche's sister,
Yeah.
and she kind of like had a very peculiar or fascist interpretation of Nietzsche's work, basically. Elisabeth Förster and Nietzsche. So they knew each other. I don't know, but yeah. Well, yeah, but it's an interesting topic. Are you doing research on it?
Sort of. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Just
don't
talk,
know.
like, let's have a discussion.
So I don't know much about banning. So, but if I'm understanding correctly, the idea is that we are in an emergency situation which has become the rule. So, but then state of emergency is of course a state of exception which becomes the rule. So like bare life becoming the rule. So, and the image would be the concentration camp. So, no law. So not just the opposites of the law, but no law at all. No moral law. No rights. No limits. No reason. So, but then I'd say no memory in the state of exception. So I guess the question is how can we remember in this state of emergency which has become the rule? I don't know if...
Actually, I have the same question. What implication has this understanding of history for memorial practice? Or like, do you have some ideas, or what would you?
So Benjamin treats history as remembrance, but of course this doesn't mean like just, as I said, it's just it doesn't mean like to remember events that happened like arbitrarily in history. But what it means is that, as far as I've understood, that you would explode those events out of the historical progress that would in a way point at the possibility of redemption in history. So you would cite in a narration of history that is conscious about its possible redemption, maybe those events that would be important for that, like in order to make that possibility, to get to an awareness of this possibility. You know what I mean? Like to, for example, like take the different revolution that existed, that maybe pointed towards a redemption of history. If you remember those as the milestones, maybe, then you get to an altogether different way of narrating the story of history than if you just narrate the whole course, or I don't know, events that maybe, rather perpetuate the status quo. See what I'm getting at?
Yeah, but I was wondering still about what like concrete actions of remembering might be more adequate to achieve this than like putting up a statue somewhere, or I don't know.
You mean like practices that people could, like people, like in a way.
How to engage with these fleeting histories, or like in a way that leaves you aware of historical pathways and maybe moments to transform them or to counter them in a way.
I think the question you're asking is like, now that we've heard that, like what do we do, right? And I think like if you're a historian, of course this answer applies differently for you, but as a normal person, I think like a thing everybody could do was to look at history and look at the potential that there is and that people already like once was aware of, and that maybe and criticize in the present that this potential is not longer something that people are necessarily that aware of. Like to be conscious of that regression that occurred, maybe that could be a way of answering this.
I think the question is a bit different whether we ask them from Benjamin's point of view, or because when we kept the perspective of modernity, there's still those big ideas that drive history and drive what is happening, and where you can be part of it. You can join one or the other big movement at that time, and think that maybe subconsciously think that you're part of this trajectory that is pointing to some sort of redemption, while now we have just accepted the status quo to a degree that we think, well, it cannot be any different, and yeah, history. I mean, we don't have those ideas of modernity, and just yeah. So I think maybe for us now also, what should we do? Things like that. Just trying to get aware of whether once was a time where the question of the meaning of history had a different, wasn't differently necessary. Maybe more necessary. Or you could say the other way around, that it's nowadays more necessary because we forgot more. Forgot more about our own history. Yeah.
But I mean, I guess also if you think about the comparison with biography, so I guess that, and I think this also maybe the central question of this is that, so if I think about my biography as a self, then I can say that I have all these experiences in my life, so now I can think about my past and think about some experiences that were merely happening to me. But then, now I can choose to own them. So I can choose to own my experiences. And this means that I'm taking charge of them and I'm making them meaningful. And so I can also choose how to just tell the story of my life because I'm taking charge of all these choices and possibilities that are part of my life, all are happening to me. But then in history, I guess that the question becomes that if history is comparable to this kind of biography, so it's also this also has this structure, then it's about sharing the burden of the past, because all the past is, so we are part of humanity, and so all these events of the past are part of our history, but then we also got to take charge of them. So like saying, I'm responsible for that kind of barbarity. But then, as you were saying, then the question is, what can I do concretely? Because then, of course, like I can say, I mean, I'm also responsible for that, I share the burden for that, but then it's part of of our history. But then, like, what do you do? And I think this is why I'm saying that I think that here the question is then that maybe, at least as far as I know, like this kind of responsibility is a traditional responsibility. So I'm guilty for something, even in this case, like I'm just guilty for something that I didn't do because maybe I wasn't even born at the time. And so I'm guilty somehow, and then I should do something because I'm responsible. But then actually, if you think about today, nobody would share the burden of history. Like nobody is taking charge of past events. And so then maybe the responsibility we should care about today, and I don't know if you agree, and like if there's a way to see that in Benjamin, is a kind of a political responsibility which is just about the future. So like even if you're not responsible, like as a guilty person, even if you're not sharing the burden of the past, you're still sharing the world today. And so you should just act just because of this reason. So even like leaving the past aside, like you can just act just because you're aware of this, like of this presence. And I guess this is like completely different than maybe than Benjamin's ideas, but yeah, I don't know if that's like
Seems approachable.
I think one of the problems Julia was getting at is that when you talk about history, because it's such a weird concept, it's like easy to like reify it in the sense that you treat it as a thing, right? That's why you insist that it's like a self-relation of the present. It's like the history is not like the things that used to exist. It's like it exists as a relation. And so with like metaphors, like the burden of the past, like the problematic thing is, I guess, that it appears like there's like the past and we're carrying it on our shoulders and it's like hard to get rid of it, and we give it like, I don't know, to the future. But like, I think we have to come to think of it as like history is being reproduced in every second in the present. For example, very palpably in education. It's like, there's generations, and what exactly is remembered of the past, of history, is reproduced in every, or has to be reproduced in every new generation through education, through, you know, the school system and the university very concretely. And the history being written by the victor, I guess, means that there's a tendency for like the uncomfortable and the alien things about history to not be reproduced, to be forgotten, or to be subdued, or to be repressed. But they're like with us somehow, and they can flash up, as it were. For example, you know, when you get like young kids or young students, I don't know, just being stung by a certain drive, and you know, I don't know, wanting to read and looking for stuff and looking for answers. That's like a way in which remembrance can show up, and it's like in the act of reproducing history. Yeah, that's one thing. I think the other thing, I mean, you hinted at it already, the idea that you're responsible vis-a-vis the future is like an image that Benjamin wants to get away from. Right. Because what's actually like haunting us is not the possibility of future suffering, but the facticity of the futility of past suffering. Not the fact that the past suffered, but the fact that the past suffering might have been for nothing.
Many people want to respond to that, I think.
Well, I have another question.
Okay. Do you want to respond? Or
just
add
quickly,
something?
like, it kind of helped me to understand now that, like, one way to reinterpret, like in a way, how to remember, or practices of remembrance would be to tackle these moments of reproduction and make them visible, and the power structures that are reproduced or like responsible for the reproduction, or how the reproduction is embedded in those historically, and yeah, to make them visible and to reinterpret, maybe find new ways to break those open. But yeah, like how you would, like which concrete form you would find to do that in the context of memorial practice, I don't know yet, but
Right.
I think that could be an answer, like provide a general direction to it.
I mean, another thing that at least Benjamin himself is very fond of, and which he addressed a lot, is art. And I guess the way history shows up in art is like with every new artwork, you produce something and you call it art, and just by that, you put it in like a tradition of everything that has been called art until now. And like, if the artist wants it or not, it's like just the fact of, you know, the audience and the general public and like the critics and so on. It's like, when something is perceived as art, there's this whole tradition which it makes reference to, and it's inevitably compared with. And everyone raises, you know, however suppressed and unconscious it may be, everyone who sits in a theater raises at one point the question, like, is this as good as Shakespeare, or is this not as good? Or, and it might just be like subconscious, or it might be done away with as, I don't fucking Shakespeare. But it's like that. It's like whenever someone is on the stage, there is Shakespeare with them, you know. And yeah, that's also, like Benjamin was very interested in that, how that happens in art. that history remains not one single expression, but history is told only by the standpoint of them who achieve victory. And so a brush history against the grain is meant like to give history another expression. And my question would be, so would a historical materialist apply this quote, like brush history against the grain, also to, for example, really bad historical events, to give them also another expression? So in general, to give history more than only this single expression it has.
You mean like different brushing history against the grain would be like an invitation for several different narrations?
Yeah. Or like,
If you
for
would be
example,
fond of that idea?
like Stalinism is like referred to as very negative.
Mm-hmm.
And would historical materialists also try to find something progressive in Stalinism?
So I think brushing history against the grain is more meant to be like a way of being critical about the overarching narrative in the first place. And I mean, this was written in the face of the shock of the Hitler-Stalin pact that Benjamin experienced. So I think a lot of these theses, of course, like they do reference to social democracy mostly, and not Stalinism, but Stalinism is definitely the background. So this idea of this self-fulfilling prophecy of reaching socialism at one point that Stalinism embodied, believed in, that is actually exactly the way of expressing history as progress that Benjamin is criticizing here. So I don't believe that he would like the idea of defending some good aspects of it. Because if the narration falls short of a redemption of history, it is just another way of telling the old story in a way, but in a perverted form, if you will, because you're at the same time appearing as if you would be enforcing that redemption. Yeah, I think we should be maybe cautious of using the idea of brushing history against the grain, and not use it in order to look at what might be apologized or something. Maybe somebody has a different view on it, I'm not sure. Just to give you this background that Stalinism, criticizing Stalinism actually was one of the major intentions here, I guess. Okay. Another question?
Well, I thought about what of this line of thought also this practice of describing the archives and looking for what is inscribed in them and what kind of histories are prolonged or, I don't know, conserved in a piece of architecture, for example. It reminded me a lot of Foucault and discourse and the archive and so on.
Hmm. You mean the arcades? You mean
The archive
yeah.
reminds me, or no, the arcades, the arcades and the arcade project reminded me of Foucault's archival ideas, or ideas about discourse and structure, formations, connected to pieces of discourse that are archival or can be considered an archive for different forms of power or whatever relations. And I wondered if this connection is very apparent to you also, or where you would draw a line maybe.
Between Benjamin and Foucault in
Yeah,
general.
like
Yeah.
post-structuralist.
I mean, Benjamin is very much referred to nowadays, also in postmodernist or post-structuralist contexts. But here, like a very big difference, I would say, is that his theory of like being conscious of those events of history that were rolled over by the overarching narrative is used a lot of times to find a theoretic background, maybe for a way of doing history as a history of the marginalized group X. And for example, there was one girl in a seminar I had on Benjamin, who wrote her doctor's thesis about women, and she used Benjamin to refer to all the women that hadn't been mentioned in the history, like in the written history of literature or something. And I think so. This is I think this idea would maybe be something that, or this is how postmodernist scholars would refer to Benjamin as well, to take him as somebody who was fighting for the single phenomena against the overarching story. But I think one difference one might draw is that for Benjamin, the concept of class is very important. Like he says that the class is actually the historical subject and the one that has been like oppressed or rolled over in the picture of history. So and the class, of course, is also intended to be, like, as I said before, or in the context of Marx's theory of classes, there are two classes. There's the bourgeoisie, and then there's the proletarian class. And in the end, with the redemption of history, you would probably have a classless society. So if you just put on, like, if you just take Benjamin as a scholar that helps you to like reference who has been forgotten if in history, but you only refer to a partiality or a marginalized group of history, I think you could do that, but it would probably would be a bit different than what Benjamin at his point in history had in mind with referring to the whole class. Yeah. But I don't know if it answered your question concerning the arcades. It was just a remark, like to show a bit how he's recepted at the moment.
Yeah, it still seems to me quite similar, like the methods, or also some general understandings. And I also get that the Marxist idea of a class struggle as a, defining structure and it as a subject makes sense, whereas in post-structuralism you have different kind of subjects, and subjectivity is somewhat unclear and vague and ambiguous and not that clearly defined. But still, I think it's also it's not exclusive. You could also address with a new Marxist sensibility towards injustices and different kind of struggles and power asymmetries between women and men, different classes or different groups within a society, through tackling the discourses that are reproducing power relations, essentially, and move a little bit away from a strictly Marxist interpretation of the world, but do a similar thing. That's what I get from it.
Yeah, as long as you still continue to do history, from the standpoint of a redemption of the whole of society, I think that works out in a way. But falling short of that aim and giving meaning to the whole of suffering, of history, that had there is no possibility, I think, that Benjamin would promote it. I don't know if somebody else has an idea of it.
I mean, I understand how it works in the case of Foucault, the history of madness or of sexuality and so on. It's just that here, I don't know, I think there's a similarity, but still, and if I'm understanding correctly, so the idea is, again, that history needs to be overcome. So, as you said, explode history out of its continuum. But then I don't know, if you want to overcome history, then it means that you should just, of course, get rid even of the concept of history. So it seems to me that in any case he's taking this position, so to speak, outside of history, because otherwise you cannot have an idea of history as a whole. So then, if you want to get rid of history, so to overcome it, I guess that you can just say, there's no way I can give you a picture of history in its wholeness. Because then, then you're just saying, we should leave history by itself, because we are limited, so we cannot bring it into purview. But here it seems to me that he's doing some kind of negative philosophy about history. So this is what I'm saying, that I don't think that he's actually overcoming history. He's just saying something that is not so... of course, he's criticizing this idea of positive progress, of optimistic progress. But again, it's just a negative philosophy. So all I'm saying is just that in Foucault's case, it seems to me that it makes sense also, because I don't know, also for his view on the self, so a subject. So basically, you have a self when you're in front of the police, because it's just being a subject in that sense. But here, I don't know. Yeah, I guess that's also another question, how can you overcome history if you're telling us a story about history in its wholeness?
mean, maybe you have to relate to all those narrations of history as a whole, because the state in which history is no longer relevant has not appeared yet. So it is just the maybe logical way to reference it, because this is the reality. But by turning it negatively, you don't like act as if history was overcome altogether already, but you do something that maybe points towards the overcoming of history, or points towards redemption. I think this is maybe what Benjamin aims to do. Yeah.
I think also his point is that universal history, whether we want it or not, lives on in both the ideology of progress and historicism, in like obscure ways in both of them, because both of them, the progressivism and the historicism, want to subdue the idea of universal history. You know, historicism is like, no, we're only like describing epochs, and we're just, I don't know, academic historiographers.
I mean, this is what most of the, I think that the subject of history, or historians that are now in the university, would probably try to do, right? To get away as much as possible from normativity while looking at the epochs.
Yeah, but all I'm saying is just that if you want to get away from normativity, then you're actually, it's a self-contradiction, because you're, in getting away from normativity, you're imposing the opposite normativity or normativity itself. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just if I say this is not a proposition, then it's a self-contradiction, because
Exactly.
So also in this case, like that's the problem with I think these negative claims, that then they are self-contradictory. I mean, then this doesn't mean that they are false, of course, like, because then you can just find a way not to just. I mean, you can find a solution there, but all I'm saying is just that you got to find it. Otherwise, the argument doesn't work. So in this sense, like I don't know, it's also about like if you make a relative claim, a relativistic claim. So for example, you say that there are no absolute truths, but then actually this statement is an absolute truth for you.
But
like, so I mean, in this sense, it's a contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
I guess Benjamin wouldn't think that what you just described is a performative contradiction, right? Isn't like you do one thing, but actually you're doing another thing, and so you're like performatively contradicting yourself.
Yeah, rationally, yes.
Right, and I think Benjamin would rather think that yes, it's contradictions, but like this whole idea of history is contradictory because the self-relation thing gets it. It's like the past, but it's the present. It's like the past existing in the present, but then it's not the past, but it's the present. But it's the present thinking of itself as the past. But the way Benjamin would like think of it probably is that history is an expression of the self-contradiction of the present society, of class society, and the way this contradiction manifests concretely is in historicism and progressivism. And both of them are self-contradictory. Historicism, on the one hand, is this idea that you only ever have, like you don't need universal history because you have different epochs, and you can only study epochs. But then universal history creeps in through the back door by the fact that it's all equidistant from God, and so it's like God and universal history kind of thing. And then the other, like in progressivism, you have the idea that you also like you push away from universal history, and no, we only have to think of how the present can achieve more progress and has already achieved progress, but you know, in things like I mean, progressivism is very widespread today. I would say, you know, there are all these ideas like we have achieved certain progress in I don't know all kinds of like minority rights and technology and I don't know international peace. And yes, there might be you know like a war here and a war there, and maybe like a constitutional amendment here and one there. But generally, you know, there's especially since the 60s, you know, 60s, our time is around, especially since the 60s, we're getting there. But we don't want to say that Columbus was that progress. You know, we don't want to go down that far. It's like, and we don't want this universal history. But then Benjamin would say the whole idea of progress only works in like this universal historical framework. Because what is it progress from? It's like there's a beginning of progress.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying that you can express something that is a self-contradiction, but your expression shouldn't be a self-contradiction. So, in philosophical terms, like, I mean, for example, I could say something about Schrödinger's cat. So that's something that seems to be contradictory, like what's going on in that box. So like we don't know like if the cat is dead or alive. But the Schrödinger's theory, of course, is not a self-contradiction, even though the object is something that looks like a contradiction. So what I'm saying here is that even if Benjamin is saying that history is based on self-contradictions, then the way he's saying it is a self-contradiction itself. And that doesn't work. This is what I'm saying.
Dialectics.
I mean, but not because that's still like the object of the expression. Because even if I say that history works history is about dialectics, that's still the object of my statement. Like history is dialectical. But my statement here, like if you just consider my statement, that shouldn't be a contradiction, but it is, because if the claim is that we should overcome history, then if you're doing actually a negative form of history, then your statement is contradictory, and it doesn't even matter if it's about something that is contradictory or not.
But that's why you should read Benjamin, because he doesn't just say history is dialectical. The way that Julie was getting at it with the conservations, it's like he gives you like citations from Baudelaire and Napoleon III and like Hegel and Flaubert, and they're all like next to each other in this really weird way. And the only thing, and he gives you like a title, like I don't know, boredom in the 1840s, and you're like, huh, what's going on? And then the constellation is like set up in a way that it's supposed to flash. You're supposed to realize, oh fuck, there's something going on, there's something contradictory. But he doesn't ever say these people are contradicting each other. So yeah, it's like, it has this, I guess you could say, performative.
He wants to transmit an experience by that. Yeah, but that's right. Now we're approaching other terrains of his thought. So I suggest we go to a pub. Okay. Yeah, thank you for listening, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ich habe das mal ausprobiert.
Oh ja, sehr gut, sehr gut.